Hello and welcome to Debate IQ. This is the fifth studio discussion brought to you by the IQ team. I'm Vishwa Sadashivan. IQ stands for Inconvenient Questions. We are Singapore's newest socio-political website. Now today's topic, or inconvenient question, is Women's Charter still relevant today? The Women's Charter is a legislative act passed by the Singapore Parliament back in 1961, with the latest amendment in 2011. It aims to protect and advance women's rights in Singapore and to promote greater gender equality. With the exception of men and women married under the Islamic law, all men and women come within the purview of this charter. The Women's Charter governs a range of issues, from regulations relating to prostitution and trafficking, roles of the husband and wife, relationship between parents and children, divorce and separation provisions, protection against family violence, and penalty for offences against women and children. Now, in recent years, the Charter has come under increased scrutiny, and I believe rightly so, with numerous calls to review it so that it could better reflect the current needs, address the current needs as well, of our society. Some people feel that the name Women's Charter is a misnomer, and that it doesn't accurately reflect the true scope of the Charter. A women's organisation, Aware in Singapore, proposed in October 2010 that the Act be renamed the Family Charter. Now, others feel that some of the provisions of the Charter are unfair to men. There are also those who feel that the Charter should be stricter in terms of enforcement. A key question is whether the Women's Charter is sufficiently relevant to today's realities. Now, to discuss these and other issues, we have with us on the panel Yap Teong Liang, a leading lawyer in the area of family law. He's also co-chairman of the Family Practice Committee of the Law Society of Singapore. Our second panelist is this extremely charming lady. I absolutely love you. She is Dr. Anamah Tan. She is a lawyer and an activist, if I may describe you as such, and an orator. Dr. Tan was the president of the International Council of Women from 2003 to 2006. She served as the Council's Asian Regional Chair. And in 2013, she was awarded the East Asia Millennium Women Peace Award for Humanitarian Services. And last, but certainly not least, is another charming lady. I could be accused of being sexist by making these remarks, I know, and that's why I'm purposely doing it. If I said charming man, then there could be other implications there. I don't want to say that. Now, last but certainly not least is Jagajit Kaur, a senior counsellor not a senior counsel, but a senior counsellor with the Singapore Indian Development Association of SINDA. She has almost 20 years of experience, right, on a daily basis dealing with people from all walks of life who have got problems pertaining to the family and so on, marriage. Once again, in today's discussion, we have a live, and I hope a lively, studio audience representing a wide spectrum of our society. Students, mothers, activists, even some husbands. Their opinions and concerns matter, as the Women's Charter will impact them, every one of us, in one way or another. Now, before we get down to discussing the topic per se, let's take a quick look at some interesting responses we got when we asked the man on the street what they knew, what they know, or didn't know about the Women's Charter.
I've heard about it, but I'm not familiar with what it says.
Vaguely, I'm not exactly sure about the details.
I don't know a lot of detail about it. Basically, it's supposed to protect women's rights, uphold and protect women's rights, but I don't know how far it extends. I'm not sure if it includes children, female children as well. Yeah.
I don't really know much on this.
I think it's just a woman. I really don't know what's a woman charter actually.
Not exactly. Have you? No.
Yes, I have.
I have heard of it. Why? What about it?
Cases like maybe abused women, or maybe some abused child, as in kids, female children, more to something like that.
I would think it covers a bit on rape also domestic abuse, and maybe a bit on voting rights.
Like in 2011, it was revised to include more provisions, especially with regards to maintenance for, I think, divorced women with children. Yeah, so it's supposed to help them better get money from their spouses, ex-spouses.
No, it is not irrelevant.
Because maybe they think that we women are, those soft type, So somehow I think we still need lah. No matter how strong you are, a woman is a woman, right?
Maybe the law can be there as a fail-safe. So like if there are parts of the group that are not like financially stable or like able to protect themselves, then at least there's still a legal law to like provide such an avenue for them to seek redress.
It's good that we have protection for women out here in Singapore, especially for those who are of less privileged backgrounds, be it in income or education. Then again, there should be a balance because in any situation there can always fall into two extremes, right? So it should not be abused.
Women still do get abused. And there are also women abusers. I think the Women's Charter should stay, but it needs to reflect that as well.
I don't think so, because it basically caters to women who wants to be protected. If you think you are independent, you don't need to be protected, then by all means you don't have to apply for any support or whatever under the Women's Charter.
Oh yes. I do hear about that. But then again, being a man, somehow or other you need to defend yourself. I mean, unless you're saying that the guy has some physical disability, then I believe the court will take the action.
As far as violence is concerned, I think the law has to be strictly like that to protect the woman. But for men, when would you ever heard about men being bullied by their wife at home?
Misandry is real, despite the fact that people think that misogyny is the only real thing. But misandry is real as well, because I used to do a bit of social work, and I have seen men who are abused. And it was not pretty, it was really not nice, it was a really nasty thing.
Okay, men need protection, but then it wouldn't be called the Women's Charter anymore. So I think there can be provisions to protect men and not just women. Yeah, and I think it's quite a real situation that's occurring, because recently there are more cases of men being abused at home as well.
Okay, we've seen the clip, some interesting comments. Now let me ask the only man other than me on the panel, right? So, let me ask you this question. Maybe I'll also include you, Anamah, on this. In 1959, Dr. Toh Chin Chai, the then Deputy Prime Minister and Chairman of the PAP, stated as part of the 5-year plan and part of the PAP manifesto, right? And this was in 1959,
Yes.
right? He said this, and I quote, "There shall be equality of women with men in all spheres." He said that. This was highly progressive in 1959.
Yes.
The Women's Charter was enacted 2 years later, right? 1961. The question is, 55 years have passed. What's our track record? Have we achieved what was declared in the manifesto of the PAP in 1959? That there shall be equality of women and with men in all spheres. Now, as you may be aware, in the Global Gender Gap Report by the World Economic Forum, every year they have this. In 2014, except for the area of income parity, Singapore, where Singapore did fairly well, came in 10th. In all other areas, Singapore lagged behind, in Singapore, women lagged behind men. Now, in the global ranking, we have been slipping over the years. In 2014, we ranked only 59th out of, we ranked 59th out of 142 countries. As a first world society, as we claim, I think we shouldn't be satisfied with being 59th out of 142 countries. So the question I have for you is, obviously some things have changed, evolved, and obviously some things haven't changed in spite of the Women's Charter, or, if I could be provocative, perhaps even because of the Women's Charter. Response?
I think that when we talk about gender equality and women having equal rights with men, I think we're not just talking about the Women's Charter, we're talking about a lot of areas. For example, women in the corporate boardroom. And certainly we are, as a country, lacking in that also, and I think recent reports, right, have also demonstrated that's one area, for example, in which we are lacking in gender equality. Income, probably with the progression of education and now more women are independent financially, there's probably a progressive step in the right direction in that particular area. Maybe not all, if you look at maybe the top income earners and how many women are there compared to men, but certainly there is a progressive step in that particular area. You know, just as an example, we certainly, I mean, the short answer to the question, certainly you don't have gender equality.
These are all economic indicators, right? I mean, I think we score fairly well in the economic aspects.
Not so well, even then.
Even then, not so well, but relatively better. But I think from the studies, in the social aspects, the progress is not as palpable. Anamah.
As far as gender equality is concerned, I think we have progressed. We have progressed quite well, but it's still a work in progress. Yeah, I feel that it will take some time. Why? For example, you say, for example, economically we have done well, but really we have not. We still have not achieved equality, where you don't talk about the top bracket or even the middle bracket, but you talk about generally across the board. However, as I said, we have made some good progress. I think in the areas that we have not progressed too well, and it's not only our country, but many other countries, politically,
leadership.
We still have made
in
some.
Leadership areas.
Oh yes, in leadership. We are still not having, too many. We only have
one full cabinet minister.
Full cabinet minister. I think that should progress a little bit faster.
You're not suggesting a quota, are you?
No. I think quota is always something that has been a bugbear for me. From the very beginning, when they were thinking of quota even in Parliament, I don't think it's a good thing.
That's not the right way.
Yes, and plus we don't want it for cosmetic reason.
So let me ask you, do you think there is an inbuilt or endemic bias? Is that the reason why we're not having enough women in key positions, in political leadership, for example? Personally, I don't think so. I don't think there is a bias, but is there a reason why women are not, is it because women are not choosing to go there, or is it because something is preventing them from doing that?
I think it's a question of both. It's a question of both. It's a question of women are not really coming forward when they have the opportunity. We have known of women who have said no when they were given the opportunity, and they have various reasons for that, and very cogent reasons too. For example, family, it's usually family. Husband may not like the fact that wife is, doing so well, things like that. But really, at the end of the day, it's a question of a balancing act. Yeah, I feel that we are progressing, and if you're talking on the Women's Charter doing this, no. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination is another important UN-led kind of, which we, Singapore, has signed and has been an active member now. And that would be another area where it is, the progress should make it faster, you know.
So my question is, if the Women's Charter has been around for 55 years and it was intended, right, to provide for an evolved environment where there's greater gender equality. And equality here would suggest opportunities, right?
Yes.
So is it because the Women's Charter has not been equipped, is not broadly defined to be able to incorporate some of these elements that you talked about? Or is it because it's not intended to?
I don't think the Women's Charter is intended to be for the equality of women in the Singapore context, or for that matter, I think that the time was ripe then. They were trying to, in 1961, where, you know, at that time there was, you know, all sorts of relationships that didn't act well for women, didn't produce the results that were. And I think that was the result of that period of time. But then the Women's Charter also has evolved. As you can see, it has had many I think huge changes, huge changes.
Okay, so let me ask Jagajit. You are a counsellor. Do you feel that the Women's Charter provides for the protection of women sufficiently today?
If you speak about, because I'm trained in doing family violence, so you see when we see victims of violence, so if you talk about protection, issuance of PPO and DO, I'll say yes. Because these are women who actually, some of them don't even know that they have such a right. It's just that when the violence gets so bad, you know, they've been in this abusive relationship for the longest time, because they don't come to us when they get their first slap or whatever. It's like they've been there for the longest time, and then, you know, things get really bad, and maybe someone tell them, look, this is the only way to go. So when they go to the court and they get the PPO, now that's good. But the thing is, you see, getting the PPO is fine. It protects me. But they're dealing with a partner who is definitely not happy about it, to the extent that, especially on the day when we feel that we need to take her to the family court and get a PPO, and sometimes we work with this client for some time to be able to have that right and say, no, it's time, you got to go and get this. On that very day, we actually have to do a risk assessment, because can we send her back home? Because the violence may accelerate. You know, she may even get more hurt. So if you're asking me whether the Women's Charter, when it comes to victims of family violence, yes, it did protect them. Now, that's the good part of it. But on the other hand, having the PPO, having the DO has also affected the marriage, because it's about, you know, I was in control, I had the power, but now the woman flashed that, you know, you try this, I'm going to call the police. So the women are using it as a weapon.
So, Teong Liang, do you also have a similar experience when you meet clients?
Yes, similar experience. And just to take it one level further, sometimes the women, in some cases, not all obviously, they apply for a personal protection order, and they use that as an area to sort of restrict or deny access to the father, to the kids. Or they said, okay, now access should be supervised, for example.
This is when they have custody and the divorce and they have custody?
Not necessarily so.
Okay.
It could just be an incident of family violence.
Oh, I see.
In which either the children are witnesses to the violence or they are victims of the violence. Right? And then you apply for a PPO and a personal protection order. That's what a PPO is. And they say, okay, now I don't think you should see the child or children. Okay, because you're a danger. It's not in the interest of the children to be with the father without supervision, for example. You know, and sometimes that happens, and if they have regular access before that, it suddenly gets cut off. And then we have to go through that process of getting to a hearing. And even if the application is dismissed, for example, you would have had a period of time in which the father may not have seen the child or the children. Right? And then when you want to try and reunite, okay, then you say, oh, but you haven't seen the child for a long time, the child is now resistant to seeing the father. And then you have a different set of problems which crop up.
Yeah,
right? So sometimes that is being used against
Do you think sometimes it results in some irreparable damage to the relationships, the three-way relationship in the family? From your experience?
Yes, it does, but I think I look at it, the relationship that's damaged is really the relationship of the child.
Yes.
It's not so much the adults, because it may have already been damaged because of the marital breakdown. But you know, the innocent child then gets dragged into that process, and then they become a pawn.
Yeah.
And they become used as a pawn, and sometimes that's the problem. Right? Yeah. So it could work in that fashion also.
Yes.
Yeah.
But yes, I would say that in this instance, there may be some cases like that, but I think in the majority of the cases, which is what legislation is for, is mainly for the majority of the cases. In the majority of the cases, I think that a personal protection order does help. And normally, I mean, in my view, when my client gets a personal protection order, I always warn them never to use it as a weapon. Because it is not right. It's not meant to be used as a weapon. It's meant to be used as a defense, to protect, to help, the family to have some harmony so that there won't be any violence any more committed. But sometimes I do understand from Jagajit's example, that it exacerbates, but I think it's a question of how it's being handled thereafter.
Sure. Maybe this is a good time to throw it open to the audience. Anyone wants to kick it off? Discussion.
So, as I discussed earlier, I brought the notion of sexism embedded in language in general. And I discussed that certain linguists have noticed or have studied that grammatical structures and phrases in languages in general have some sexism. And we had discussed earlier that this could possibly be embedded in the Singapore legal framework. And what has possibly happened is that there may be some sense of chauvinism that has been written by very well-intentioned authors of the legal structure, but have become chauvinistic as a consequence because of embedded subliminal messages which are possibly sexist. And perhaps you can comment on this.
I mean, from what I see from the legislation, I mean, it's not come across the viewpoint you have looked at or from that angle as to whether there are subliminal messages, right? I think as a lawyer, we're probably looking at the literal interpretation of the language of the statute and what its effect is, rather than going back and is there a subliminal message, right?
But are you just talking about the legal documents, or are you talking about a certain predisposition to this issue of gender equality? That society, whether culturally or otherwise, people have certain orientation about men being superior, stronger, women being inferior, and so on. Is that what you're talking about?
I'm talking about both, because sometimes they can be intrinsically linked. So perhaps there are people who have like certain ideas on gender equality or inequality, and that could possibly be indirectly written down in the legal framework.
Okay.
And it could be subconsciously done.
If you move away from what's written in the documents, but how it is interpreted by people, right? And how it is actually acted upon. I think that's where I think you can get a lot more subjectivity, right? It is not altogether impossible that a person who has been appointed a judge may himself or herself have certain bias in this area. I mean, being human, you can't say the moment you're a judge, you're going to be absolutely neutral. It is possible for people to have certain bias. How does the system have the ability to check where there is this bias in the people who have the authority to make decisions?
That's a difficult way to try and put a judge to see whether they are biased because of gender.
I'm just giving the judge as an example.
Yeah, okay.
You know, it could be a politician, it could be a minister. You know, there are people who have a certain bias, and they are in a position of power. It could be a GP teacher as well. You know, any one of us who is in a position. You can be a father, and you can have those values embedded in you, and you could be unwittingly transmitting those values to your children. So the question is, how does the Women's Charter or the system sort of prevent that from resulting in undesired outcomes?
That's difficult, because let me tell you that from my experience in having sat in the UN Committee on the Women, on CEDAW, which is this convention I was telling you all about, against this convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. We have reports from various countries around the world, that have to report to this committee. We find that particular embeddedness of ideas, has been one of the major drawbacks to implement this particular convention with regard to eliminating all forms of discrimination, the bias. And that, I'm afraid, you cannot just have a legislation to say you cannot have this kind of bias. The legislation may be there, but it's how it's being enforced at the end of the day that whether or not this bias will continue. So
Right.
that is
So you do acknowledge that this bias can come into play when you are in a position where you're making judgment calls, right? And
Yes.
the Women's Charter, like any other legal document, is open to interpretation, right? But I guess to some extent, it is cultural, right?
it is,
I mean,
yes.
we
Yeah.
talk about, I
Traditional.
mean, the way an Asian, the way an Indian, ethnic Indian, the way an ethnic Chinese, for example, would look at it may even differ, all things being equal. So there is the cultural element that comes into the way we look at legislation as well. And so the legislation could be culture neutral in the way it's drafted, but the way we read it and implement it could actually differ, you know. But I think as long as we acknowledge the point that it is not going to be a perfect situation, as long as human beings are involved in making judgment calls. Let's move on to things that are a bit more concrete. Let me ask this question. The issue of maintenance orders, right? Maintenance. When there's a separation and there's a custody of the child and then somebody has to pay maintenance or alimony, right? There's a general notion that the Women's Charter is stacked against the man, right? Who has to, by default, pay maintenance. And there have also been situations where the woman in this case, earns more than the man and they're divorced and they want maintenance as well, right? Now, the classic example is a case of Justice, what's his name? Chu Han-teck, right? Justice Chu Han-teck actually say he denied a woman's application for spousal maintenance and disagreed with the need for what he calls token maintenance. And in his words, he said, if the woman is truly equal and independent, she does not require, nor would she, I think, desire patronizing gestures. It's a very interesting judgment. I think it's quite isn't it a landmark sort of a judgment where he's making a clear statement that if you don't need it, don't ask for it and don't expect it.
I think before that judgment came out, which probably I think was the third quarter of last year, right? Where you have wives who are working, who earn a very decent salary, some even more than the husbands. And when it comes to the divorce and talking about the maintenance for the wife, generally, and I say generally, they would not be asking for a lot of maintenance per month. It's what they call nominal maintenance and with the judgment token maintenance. And normally that quantum is $1. The reason why that is sort of evolved, right, is so that if at the end of the day the wife eventually loses a job through a variety of reasons and cannot get back to the job market, then that allows the wife to then vary that $1 maintenance upwards because there's been a change of circumstances financially on her part. Right? There are cases where in the same kind of situation where the wife earns a good salary more than the husband sometimes or equal, the court may say, look, I'm not even going to award you any maintenance, not even token.
So Teong Liang, let me ask you, the variance in circumstances is not the sole domain of the woman. The variance in circumstances can also happen to the man.
That's correct.
So does the law apply equally to both types of variance?
It does.
When
I say the variance, for example, if the wife gets, let's say, $1,000 in monthly maintenance, and then there's a variance in the financial circumstances of the ex-husband. He loses his job for a variety of reasons, incapacity, etc., and he can no longer provide that $1,000. He can go back to court to vary it downwards, right, because of his material change of circumstances. So in that sense, the material changes of circumstances which the Women's Charter provides for applies to both sides, whether for the wife's side to increase it, right, or from the husband's side to reduce it. Right? But certainly we can't, as the law now stands, and perhaps this is where the Women's Charter needs to look at coming or moving forward, right, is whether men can claim maintenance from wives or ex-wives. And
So,
certainly there can be a variety.
Let me
of,
ask the first-year law student seated here. Do you think men should be allowed to claim maintenance?
Actually, I just read an article by I think Professor Debbie Ong. She also expressed that same desire for men, or deserving men, to be given the opportunity for maintenance. So my question is, given that it's quite commonsensical and logical for a deserving man to also obtain maintenance if he really deserves it, why is there so much resistance towards this? Where is this resistance coming from? And can we expect changes in the immediate future, or is it going to take a longer period of time?
Sorry. Okay, Sharon, you were dying to say something.
I think it was the issue of bias again, because all this while, women have grown up thinking like, oh, the man is supposed to look after you, and that's his job to look after you.
He's
and
bigger, stronger. He's the hunter-gatherer.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
And so when women even start working, I mean, honestly speaking, they still have that notion in their mind, yeah, the man is supposed to look after me, so why should I look after the man? Even I'm earning so much money, I don't need to look after the man. I think a lot of women, they may not dare say it, but I think a lot of them think that way. It's about time that...
So in a way they are perpetuating
no,
the
not really, but
gender
it's about
stereotype.
time that they've got to change some of their mindset in that sense also, because this is the traditional notion of how most women think, I believe, and that's the reason why they are against this thing about men having maintenance.
Yeah. So, but it doesn't answer Farah's question. His question is not so much that women are resisting it, but why is the system resisting it, right? If I get you correctly.
Another issue is because the question is, what is the concept of a deserving man? Yeah, who is a deserving man? I mean, there can be men who claim for maintenance and they sit in the house and do nothing and don't even bother finding a job.
I think you're being very sexist.
No, I'm not being
I mean,
very
there are a lot of
sexist.
men who don't do that.
No, I know there are a lot of men who don't do, but there are also a lot who do. Because I work at the volunteer group, and we come across a lot of cases where they are.
Okay, the question is, what would you do if you find this exceptional man who is noble, who actually doesn't do all those things that it's very rare, I know what you're saying, but let's say this rarity actually occurs. That you find this...
Then I will say he comes within the definition of a deserving man.
Okay. Which is a real exception.
Yes,
You got to defend this man. Defend manhood.
Yeah,
Come on.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Now's my time, right?
Now's the time. Or never.
Let me just give you an example, right? If you have a ex-husband, who then becomes incapacitated, right, and therefore loses his job, cannot get back in the job market. In that one area, should the man be able to claim maintenance from the wife? Give you another example. You have men, and today's day and age, who are more hands-on in looking after children, right? They do the night feeds, they wake up, they change the diapers, right? They spend time with the kids. And you may have, and I've come across cases in which the man gives up the job, right? Becomes the house husband, and does all the faring, the routines for the kids, while the wife has a stable job, good job, and develops her career over a 10, 15, 20-year marriage, right? And then when they get the divorce, now the reverse situation happens, right? The man is out of the job market for 10, 15 years. In that scenario, should the man not be entitled to claim maintenance?
And what you're saying is currently it's not provided for.
Currently you can't claim in any of the spectrum.
So is he deserving?
In that sense, I feel he deserves the maintenance. Because
And he's another exception.
He's doing things that, where in a marital relationship you're supposed to do. If you can't work, maybe take care of the house or take care of the kids. And that applies to both parties, men and women. Yeah, it doesn't go beyond that. I mean, you don't expect the women to work, to take care of the family, and you sit down and later you say, oh, I can't work, I can't find a job, I need you to pay me maintenance. It's not going to work that way. You've got to put effort in the relationship.
But if you accept that there are exceptional circumstances where men conduct themselves well, and therefore they are deserving.
Yes, there are cases like that. Yeah.
As long as these exceptional circumstances do exist, then there should be provision to celebrate these exceptional circumstances.
And I think it's only fair to the men.
That goes back to Faraz's question. why is there resistance to provide for it? When you provide for it, the law provides for it, doesn't mean you get it, right? You still have to
Prove it.
Prove it.
Prove it.
Exactly. So I think that if we are able to trust the court's discretion with regards to what constitutes a deserving woman, likewise we should trust the court's discretion with regards to what constitutes a deserving man. So I don't suppose that if we allow a man to claim maintenance immediately, many men would begin getting maintenance
We're not that hard
payments.
up, you know.
Exactly. The court will still have to make a value judgment, I believe.
I mean, we could consider an incremental approach, right, in dealing with specific kinds of instances. Whether we just do the instance of an incapacitated man, or we include the house husband, right? I mean, if you just say, let's allow the Women's Charter now for men to claim maintenance for women, but hang on, you have one major condition, you got to be incapacitated. It may not go down well. It's like trying to change it, trying to evolve it, but hang on a second, I'm not quite in good faith trying to evolve it. I'm still putting conditions to it.
But seriously speaking, you don't need to be incapacitated to be deserving. You could just have lost your job for several years and not been able to get a job. I mean, there could be situations like that. Basically, you're much as not for want of trying, you've not been able to get a job. There are situations like that. Now, in such a case as well, so you don't necessarily just have to be incapacitated, but you're not able to get a job. In those cases, you should also be a deserving case, right? Now, if at this point, it'd be useful to say, is the term women's charter a misnomer? How many of you think it should be changed to capture what it's really meant to be? A family charter, as aware is. Right?
Yeah,
so the moment you define it as a women's charter, then it becomes a charter that tries to fulfill the requirements of that name.
Family needs.
Or people start viewing it as meant for women. But there is something to the name, right? So if you change it to something that's a lot more gender neutral, like the family charter, I think
subliminal message.
Yeah, the messaging changes. People will view it differently.
Yes.
And some of these bias may actually change as a result. Victor, you had a view on this earlier on.
I wanted to ask if, because we're talking about the burden being on the men to prove that they're deserving, I'm also curious as to whether the Women's Charter as it stands now, given the cases you've seen, on what basis does a woman qualify for maintenance? Because I have a story of a friend who, this is some time back, so I don't have the details, but what I am aware of was that they were divorced because she cheated on him, but he was obliged to pay maintenance. So I'd like to just ask for clarification on what the burden of proof what's.
And is it fair?
Is it fair? Yeah.
In such a situation? Yeah. Anamah.
I want to know what the facts of the case would be, yeah? But the fact is, I think at the end of the day, maintenance is based on the needs of the woman and the family. So usually when there are children, the maintenance should come about. But whether or not you say deserving, it's not a question of deserving, the needs are there. In the case of men, although it's not in the charter that the men should be given maintenance, in the case of men, I had one very interesting case of a house husband. This is very early days when house husbands are not known, yeah? And this man had been, they both made an agreement that wife should then go out to continue with her work, which is doing quite well, and he will stay at home. And at that point of time, they were earning about the same salary. And 10 years down the road, wife is doing very well indeed, and decides she wants out of the marriage. They have 2 children. And at the end of the day, I was fighting so hard for this man. I assure you, I do
have male clients as well.
Have male
That's
clients.
good to know.
Yeah. Well, and I felt it was very, very unfair that he only got 20% of this massive wealth that they had created together. And I would have thought that at the minimum I should get is at least 45%.
So why didn't he get it?
didn't get it because I think it was not at that point of time.
Why are you speaking so
wasn't he
softly,
going to work?
Sarah?
Why can't he get work now? Well, you know, the usual thing, yeah? And unfortunately, maybe at that point of time, the learned judge was not so attuned with what is happening now. And I must say that I did ask my client to go and appeal, but he was not willing to spend extra money.
So in other words, what you're saying is, in response to Victor's question, is it's not a moral imperative.
Yes.
It is a utilitarian factor. Yes. Right? So in other words, there's a need, regardless of morally who was
wrong,
who rocked the boat. No, that's not the issue. Who needs to be fed?
Yes.
So it is a very practical consideration. Okay, sorry, Siupin, you had a question.
Yes, I would like to say that I think the term maintenance fees has given usually women a sense of entitlement that regardless of whether you are the one who filed for it, right, you will know that most likely you will have it, and it is definitely not fair to the man. And also, while the discussion was going on just now, I feel very sad upon hearing the word exception. The man, right, has to be exceptionally something in order to get maintenance fees, and it's very sad. It shows that our society is not as progressive as we claim to be.
Wow, I'm so happy you brought
True.
up that point. Yay. Okay.
True.
All right.
We are not progressive. That's a fact.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a fact.
So we just need to acknowledge it.
Accept that and acknowledge it.
We need to acknowledge
Yeah.
it, but not assert it. Okay.
I mean, you see, the point is, we still come back to the economics, yeah, of the whole exercise. Are women earning equal, yeah, salary with the men? Are they? I think the answer is still not yet.
Yeah, but
Not yet.
But let's not use a broad brush.
Yeah.
Anamah. Let's not use a broad brush. There are different strokes meant for different folks, and I think society has progressed enough for us to have the ability to have different brushes.
You
and
know,
not
I
just
agree.
one
I
big
agree
brush.
with Mr. Farah.
Yeah.
I agree with him.
She likes you.
No,
She's
it's
going
not
back to
nothing.
you. Okay. Sorry, I need to go to Vanessa. She's been trying to make a point for the longest time. Yes.
It's good that it's taken this long. I think it's very interesting what we've all been talking about. So I have reservations about calling it the family charter.
Family charter, okay.
I don't like women's charter either, but family charter is obviously a bit touchy because we have seen over the past few months the word family has been co-opted into a very narrow definition. I also want to address the point on the bias that you were speaking about. So CEDAW, right, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, in 2011, the Singapore cycle, the committee actually told the Singapore government to enact legislations to prevent discrimination against lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgender people. But even though this recommendation was written into the report, it was eventually not taken up by the Singapore government, and then we had a lot more problems down the road. So I just wanted to also point out on that note, I might be jumping around a little bit, that, you know, stuff like family violence, stuff like intimate partner violence, stuff like, your partner not doing anything, sitting at home on their bums, or not caring enough for the family, these are also issues faced by the lesbian and gay communities, as well as the transgender community who have not undergone the sex reassignment surgery because they're still considered gay under the law. So that one clause in the Women's Charter that delegitimizes same-sex marriages actually reduces our access to the personal protection order with all its flaws and all its contentions, the maintenance provisions with all its flaws as well. So I just want to point out that even though it started out as something to protect people, right? Protect women and girls as in the...
Yes.
It only protects certain types of people. That's the point I would like to make for comments and discussion.
Interesting point. Lawyers.
I think if you're talking about violence between partners, certainly the Women's Charter would not apply. The provisions of the Women's Charter would not apply to partners, right? But you have an alternative legislation, right, which you can file a complaint, a magistrate's complaint in the criminal courts, right, and use the penal code as a remedy to try and redress the wrong. If you're talking about maintenance, that's certainly a huge challenge, because I don't think there's any other legislation, right? We should then allow partners to go and claim maintenance from each other. But if, for example, partners buy a property, for example, and they have joint names and they contribute towards the property and the relationship breaks down, certainly how do you then divide that particular asset, right? The Women's Charter would not apply, but you could apply, for example, property law, right, in terms of whether there's a trust involved. You still look at contributions, but under property law, not under the Women's Charter. So it's not the divorce component, but it's still the law still recognizes that you may have contributed, right, and look at that and divide that particular property if there's a dispute as to ownership or as to share the proceeds of sale eventually.
But if I could maybe look at it slightly differently, right? It's a Women's Charter that's supposed to protect women who are in danger as well. But it is restricted to marital relationships.
Yes.
Now, so in Vanessa's case, if you have an intimate partner, right, and there is abuse in that relationship, it's an abuse outside of marriage, because it's not technically marriage. She is not entitled to the PPO.
Yes, she's not.
So, in that case, how does the Women's Charter protect this woman?
Does not.
At this point in time, it does not.
So it is discriminating. The Women's Charter is actually discriminating against a woman because she is with another woman.
The Women's Charter is supposed to protect the relationship of a husband and a wife.
No, but it's
And
also
under
is supposed to.
according to the law, a husband and a wife is a male husband and a female wife.
No, but it's also supposed to protect the rights of women and girls, right? That's another part of it. She's a woman, and you're having a relationship with another woman, which means there are two women here who may need protection, and the Women's Charter fails to do that. What's the reason for that?
No answer, because it does not provide any.
It's because there's something else above the charter that dictates how the charter is to be understood, and interpreted, and employed. That's the whole point that we have been talking about earlier on, right? It is not the text; it is the way the text is read and put into action. And that is predicated on values that society or the people who are in a position of authority in society decide on. So there is a bias.
There is a bias.
There is a bias. And I think that is the point that arises from this. Yes?
So I would like to compliment Vanessa's point on this. I completely concur with you on everything on this. Perhaps there should be a way in which legally we can broaden the definition of family, the notion of family, basically transcend the traditional conceptualizations of family, like having a man and a woman being in a married relationship and having children. Go beyond that. Some families do not have a marriage involved. They may not necessarily be a man or a woman being the main partners. There could be a lesbian or a homosexual couple or a transvestite couple and other combinations being involved in their family, and they may have children too.
In that case, I mean, there are legislative issues, right? That's not the way family is defined in Singapore, right?
I mean, it doesn't fall within the traditional definition
of course
family.
not.
So
or even the legal definition.
So the question is it time to relook,
broaden the
definition of what is acceptable through societal norms? And it's a question of whether society as a whole is progressive enough as a society to be inclusive. I mean, in some countries it has been, they have accepted, I mean, even in nearby countries to Singapore. Right? So the question is whether or not as a society Singapore is ready to broaden that definition. And certainly I suppose when that time comes, when we do not know, right? But if there's a movement, there's enough, for want of a better word, groundswell, right? That time may come sooner rather than later, right? But I don't think, if you ask me personally, that is a closed discussion. I think it is an open discussion. And certainly if we keep that discussion open, then things will progress. It's just that how we have progressed, right, over the last 50 years, right? Not by keeping quiet, but by having discussions. And this is one forum of it.
And I think your point about having to broaden the definition, if we fail to broaden, as a society, if we fail to broaden the definition of family, what constitutes a family, conventionally and legally, then Vanessa and others like Vanessa will not be able to benefit from it being a family charter. In fact, it will be disadvantages, right? If I may just ask Sherry, would you want, you're also someone who is not benefited from our definition of inclusive society.
Yes.
Would you want to share with us why?
Because as you all know, I'm a transgender woman, so it's kind of hard to fit whether I'm in the male category or the female category, because my IC is male, but the way I dress up, the way I live my life is as a female. So which one logically do I fit in?
Let me ask you a very practical, it may be an embarrassing question. Which restroom do you go to?
That's another question I'm about to ask.
Yeah, which restroom do you go to?
I will go usually to the handicap. Oh, yeah.
Okay. What's the conflict that you face internally? The fact that you have to go, you can't go to either the male restroom or the female restroom. How does it make you feel?
It's kind of hard for me. So it will be good if there's a solution for a transgender woman who can obtain a female IC without going through the SRS.
SRS stands for sex. What does it stand for? Reassignment surgery. Okay. So until you have the surgery, you will not be classified as a woman, right?
Yes, correct.
Which means that what is your legal status in the meantime?
Male.
Male. So what is your request? What are you hoping for?
So I'm hoping for that for a transgender woman, that's maybe there's a consideration of giving them, you know, a new forgo the need of going for the SRS to obtain a female IC. Because as for me, I'm dressing as a woman because I believe in my heart I'm a woman, and if I can't go to the female's toilet because I'm a male, so I have to resort going to the handicap toilet, and it will regard to the human right of my right as a human.
Sure.
I feel violated by all this.
No, but if I could share this with you, if I were a policy maker, I would be in a dilemma as to what to do. Because if I allow you, because you've got male sex organs, if I allow you to go to a female toilet, I may not be fair to the women. You see, you see, policymakers have the dilemma of having to make policy that's fair to the vast majority, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're biased against you, right? On the other hand, you don't feel that you are a man. Therefore, you don't feel comfortable going to a male toilet. Now, that is a dilemma, and it's understandable. But from a legal point of view, what recourse is there from a legal point of view? For someone like Sherry.
I had a very interesting case very early on. I think it was in the early 1970s. This lady I met in Hamburg, in Germany, and she wanted my help to get herself as registered as a female, because each time she goes through customs in immigration, she gets frisked. Because her passport says she's male, and she's really very, very female.
Yeah.
And she says, "Can you please help me?" And in those days, there was no recognition of any kind. So we have moved a lot to now, when you go through the SRS, then at least you will get female on your identity card. But your birth certificate, you cannot change. Yeah. So at least there's some movement there, which I think at some point of time is true. If you don't get your you don't do the surgery and all that. It's difficult to get how to classify, is it?
I mean,
classify you.
There would be a problem. I mean, how do you classify? Because technically, you are a male still, because you have not had the surgery, right?
So my,
Yeah,
sorry, I mean, my empathy lies with you completely, but I think you have to make some kind of a decision there.
Yeah.
Can I make a very quick point?
Yes, please.
Just to point out that SRS surgeries are not provided in Singapore. You have to go to Thailand to do it, and it can cost up to $10,000.
Yes, yes.
It used to be provided during
SS Ratnam.
Yes, Dr. Ratnam, Professor Ratnam's time, and it was quite progressive during that time, and that's how I got his help to change this lady's this thing, because she went through the reassignment, to make her female, and then she got a passport which says she is female. But let me tell you that it was a difficult journey, and it was through Professor Ratnam who really helped me, and I had a very, very helpful person in the passport office who then agreed that we should not be using the birth certificate, we should be using the new certificate.
I just have a question that I want to ask. Do you think there's absolutely no potential in the future for policy and law to move towards the direction of striking a balance? Because I think what she is saying is that, maybe for some reason there are circumstances that prevent me from getting this surgery, but I do believe very strongly that this is what I want to be. So
I totally agree with you, but there you go.
Yes,
unless you see, I would imagine there would be a policy dilemma, unless you recognize a third sex.
I was wondering if there's any way that, the law could take into consideration other factors. For example, I understand from my knowledge of law that in proving against certain criminal cases, for example, you don't just look at exactly what is written down in black and white, but you consider the circumstances surrounding it as well. So is there any way that the law could take into consideration these circumstances? For example, you could look at more like her history, what she has been, doing in the past few years and stuff like that, rather than just always basing the law on a piece of paper, which is your birth certificate.
The question of the law is the policy maker, right? Then once the policy makers decide what ought to be the law, then it goes into the drafting of the legislation, then it goes into all the consultations, and then it comes into legal force, and then it goes into the final stages of as and when it arises, how that law is applied to different circumstances. So we are actually have to go back, right, to the start, right, and the start would be the policy makers. The judges don't make law; they apply the law.
Yeah.
The lawyers interpret the law. We all hope to make law from what we interpret. We are most of the time not very successful.
But you can make representations
you can.
that will influence and shape the passing of law by the legislators. But I would suggest that our stakeholders, in this case the legal fraternity, can do a lot more in advocacy. And I think it will influence lawmaking over time. It's my view, and I think we probably should consider that. Right, we need to switch gears. Silvam, I'll come to you. I know you're raring to go. But first, I'd like to go to Jag.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you about custody battles.
Sure.
How from your experience as a counsellor, how custody battles have impacted on children, and how the Women's Charter should or could be modified, or behavior could be modified to reduce the kind of collateral damage that children face, when actually it's meant to be in the interest of the child.
Absolutely.
All decisions, but in the end, that's not what happens. I don't think anyone intends it that way, but the way it happens, the child, like what Teong Liang you highlighted, the child suffers.
Absolutely.
Right. Could you share some of your own perspectives on that?
Okay. What we do is, in cases of where this marital dispute, our focus is very child-centric. So more than often, we often tell them that, look, you have all these differences, but you know, at the end of the day, you have this shared entity. So whatever decisions you're going to make, it has to be in the interest of the child. So that is in cases where there's no violence. But in the cases where there is, where the kids have witnessed violence, we know that as counselors, there is this trauma. And we have actually done group work concurrently with women who were victims of family violence and children, their kids who have actually witnessed their violence. And what is interesting here is that there is a lot of, because of the, like I mentioned earlier, these women who actually come to us, they don't come to us in the early stage, like they have been abused in the first 1 year or something. It's a long time. And similarly, the kids have witnessed that. So what happened is when we do this, and some of these are very young kids, they're as young as 4 years old, and because they're not able to externalize, unlike the adults, because they're able to talk about it through therapy, we are able to, you know, do some healing work and so on. But with these kids, they actually suffer in silence. So sometimes we have to do things like art therapy and so on. So when you talk about the custody, yes. So when this decision is made that, okay, you know, I'm going to have the children and you're going to have the visitation. So like I mentioned earlier, the thing about the visitation is because when especially in an abusive relationship where the violence has been there for a very long time, the women actually sometimes don't allow the husband to have SS. That's why, you know, you have this supervised SS. We counselors have to sit in the room. You know, the dad has to, he's only able to see the child in our presence because of safety. So in all divorces, as a counselor I can tell you this, in every divorce, children do get affected because to them it's, you know, mom is there and dad is here. They go to school and they see at the meet the parents session, the parents are together and they are not. So they come back and they say, but why dad isn't there? But for some reasons, for some very good reasons, especially in an abusive relationship, then this is the best way to go. So what happened here in this custody, especially when there's this maintenance issue, then what the mother does is, your dad is not giving the maintenance, there's no need to see him. So, you know, your dad is not giving money, there's no need for him to pick you up. So this issue about custody, as a counselor, it definitely affects the kids.
But this is the point that you raised earlier, right, about how it affects a child.
Yes.
Is this your experience as well?
Just the last point you made. Sometimes the problem with the custody battles is in a dispute, the parties tend to look backwards. You know, and you know, one of the previous chief justices used to say, right, you want to move away from affidavits which are the womb to tomb. So you start from the day they were born. Right? Then you talk about night feeds, you talk about breastfeeding, you talk about all the way, but actually the children are now 10 and 11 years old at the time of divorce. So, you know, what happens in the early days may not be so relevant. So the focus now really is to look to the future arrangements, right? So what will be the best interest for the kids moving into the future as opposed to focusing in the past, right? And that's really where the courts are looking at now, and there are a whole variety of approaches, right, which the courts look at and which are really child-centric, which helps the parents actually to focus, because the tendency is to focus on their problems. And like I said earlier, they use the children as the pawn, right? And they use that as the bargaining chips and you know, putting each other down, etc. But in that process, they actually forget, right, that the children are affected deeply. And the worst things, I think, you may not see it immediately. It sort of perpetuates itself, right? Probably a few years down the road.
Definitely, because there'll be all this, you know, unhappiness, and then, you know, they will use the child against one another. The child would be affected. In fact, like earlier you mentioned, I mean, these kids, when they're young, probably they just internalize all these emotions, and it's only much later when we see them. And, you know, sometimes we are working with a 36-year-old man, and what he talks about is a trauma that he went through when he was 9. So we actually have to go back to the 9 year and heal. So all this emotional abuse, or rather emotional state of the child, it all shows up later years in life. And so much so that some of them are not even able to hold relationships when they move on. In their own marriages,
it's a
you know.
cycle.
Yes.
Right.
And some of it they learn a behavior. They learn something that, and it's so difficult when they come to us and they have to unlearn it.
Right.
Yeah, Anamah, I just want to mock the court because of what you said. You buy something in courts and you don't pay, you apply for gyro, everything goes from your salary. the law will come after you. But this is your family. This is what you worked for, and you signed a paper with this woman, you know, and the law cannot enforce. Yeah, and the law cannot enforce. I'm really seriously sorry for the law.
Yes.
Okay, policies and laws are made to protect people, their lives,
Agreed.
the human. Okay, let's not talk about woman or man, the human nature. When you enacted this law in 1961, in the 50s, I was born 6 years later. Okay, that time there was a lot of family violence. Yes, men beat women, women beat men. That's normal from where I came from. But there was harmony. You know, they trash it out and there was harmony. But now we are educated. We are no more cavemen. The thing is, because of education, we are abusing the law and destroying the family. I've heard a lot of words from all of you all in the panel. You know, family violence, you know, child abuse by the mother against the father. Maybe you must enact a law, you know, so that the mother cannot groom the child against the father in the case of divorce, or the other way, right? What I'm coming at is, how are we going to change this law, which was enacted in 1959, changed in 61 and now in 2011, to suit the modern day family, where the woman is earning enough and the man is also earning enough, and the children are also studying. Okay, everybody is looking at each other for the equal partnership in the family. How are we going to teach the children to lead a family better than how we led? Okay, to me, my family rule is, you will never use the D word, the divorce word. When you start using the D word, that's when all hell breaks loose. You know, I always tell my wife, you do not urge me to get angry. When I get angry, I may do things that you may not like. I will do the same. That's partnership rules. I think what the law should seriously consider is the 3-year period, you know. Force these two people, the husband and the wife, to go for serious therapy and counseling before the law actually decides, here you go.
Is that provided for right now?
Yes, under the new act,
they have to go through
it is mandatory that before you file the divorce, you have to go through pre-divorce counselling. It's in the legislation. The structures are all being set up. Obviously, MSF will be, one of the agencies, right, who will be overseeing that. So it's not been implemented yet, because the new Family Justice Act and the Family Justice Rules will be implemented in phases. We just can't put everything all, 1st January and everything starts running. So some parts have been implemented already. The rest are coming up in phases. Right? So in that sense, the point you make, yes, there will be pre-divorce counselling. And before you even file the divorce, one of the documents you will have to file to get a divorce is like a little certificate, right, that you have attended the pre-divorce counselling. So that will become one of the requirements.
Christopher, yeah, you wanted to add something? Yeah.
I'd just like to say that I agree and I disagree with Silva, because I think what's actually getting to the heart of the issue is that the family is a very uneasy locus where the state and the law have to intervene. And it seems to be the case we've heard for, in terms of the definitions of family, how and what the law should do. So I guess the question I have is that what we have is, we are talking about an evolving law. We also have a family sphere that is trying to increasingly define itself autonomously of the state and of the law. And what I'm wondering is that from the legal profession and from the counselling profession, where is the limit? Because I agree that the law has to keep up with changing times, but I disagree that the law has to intervene more into the locus of the family. So I'm not sure how you see that tension from your perspective. Should there be a limit after which we say the law can no longer go here?
Or the law should?
Or the law shouldn't go here? I guess that's how
Great question. Anamah.
I think even before the, pre-counselling, before the divorce, they should have done the marriage counselling earlier, which they have put into practice now, which is quite good. But I think even before the laws were passed to ensure that there's some kind of counselling before the divorce proceeds, the family court has already started much earlier on to have counselling as soon as any divorce is filed, and in the early days it was if they have children below the age of 8. Now it's up to 21. So they have progressed from below 8, then up to 14, then now it's 21. So there has been progress over the few years. And then until the Family Justice Act, which was passed, it's called the Family Justice Act. And that comes into operation from 1st of January 2015, quite new, and therefore that's where Mr. Yap has said that, implementing all these requirements as we go along. So now we are going to have pre-divorce counselling. That means before you file your divorce papers, you have to go for counselling.
It's already in place, right?
Yes.
Pre-divorce counselling. But maybe to respond to your questions and your comment, we should look at alternative dispute resolutions. Right. Now, law is just one way of settling issues. But as a society, and this would be a useful concluding point for us, as a society, should we not start seriously looking at alternatives to legal recourse?
Absolutely.
Should legal recourse not be the last recourse? But a lot of times, because we're becoming very litigious as a society, litigation seems to be the first course of action. But as a society, should we not start moving in that direction? Jagajit, what do you think?
Yeah, in fact, we are so grateful when a couple actually walk in and say, you know what, I need help. I'm seeing some cracks in my marriage. And that's what we're looking for. But the issue and the problem here is the perception about counselling. Somehow it's the Asian, and so much so even some of the minority communities, they see counselling as only when I have problem I go to counselling. So the view about counselling. But seriously, when a woman call in and say, something is not right, and we often tell her, good, you can come in, I can work with all your emotions and everything, I can help you. But your partner need to come in, because whatever work I do with you, when you go back, you're going back to the same environment. So if you were to say, we are very happy before you get to the law, we acknowledge them, we tell them thank you, thank you for coming, and which means you see some hope, and it also validates the point that they want to make the marriage work, they want to put in the effort. So this is what we look forward to. What saddens us is when we have to do mandatory counselling. As compared to counselling, as a counsellor being in this profession, I can tell you, when I have to do counselling, I think it's more fulfilling than doing mandated, because seriously, they're not happy. These guys walk in, they probably have heard these women, and they're going to come in and see another woman like me. So it takes time
just
for
going
us.
through the motions.
Yes, they just do. And sometimes it's so challenging because they say, okay, are you done? The court. I say, no, I'll report to the court, and they don't turn up. So sometimes all this fear and dread, but at the end of the day, but like what Anamah said, the PPO is good in the sense that at least they are getting help. So what we do is we say, okay, let's work on this issue. And then we go to the couple work. Because we need to address this first. Once we are able to fix this, then we'll say, okay, both of you are ready. Now we'll do the couple work. So them coming to us before the law is much more.
Well, alternative dispute resolution certainly is a big movement now. Certainly it has been when the Women's Charter was amended in 2011. It was already, it gave the courts the power to order parties to go for mediation. In the past, mediation was voluntary. Right? So, it's a question of whether you volunteer, and you can't, the courts didn't have the power to enforce it. But with the 2011 amendments, they could order parties to go for mediation to resolve their disputes or counselling. Certainly in the PPO aspects, as part of the orders the court can make, it can order parties to go for counselling, and PAVE is one of the organisations, right, which are involved in that kind of counselling. certainly in the new Family Justice Act, the ethos and the whole approach really is, as you said, the court is the last resort. Right? So a lot of it is really to see what other areas we can resolve the dispute without going to court. So mediation is one. Collaborative family law is another area of alternate dispute resolution. Right? Mediation can be in different forms, and there are so many avenues of mediation, whether it's private, whether it's through the Singapore Mediation Centre, whether it's through the courts, and certainly in the amendments to the 2011, also the focus of the Child Focus Resolution Centre was one of the things, and you know, in Central Mall now is actually it's part of the Family Justice Courts, but it's a dedicated office area where when you have children, you have to go through that. Okay, it's mandated. Okay, for parents to go, and they'll sit in with a family counsellor who will speak to both the parents. Right? So that is already in process, and that's, I think, proven to be a success. Okay, because they have to also now move premises, right? Because the current premises are just too small.
Yeah.
Right.
So so the question, Anamah, for you as a quick comment is: do you think, as a result of legislation making this mandatory and so on, do you think we are successfully moving towards a culture of mediation as opposed to litigation?
I think on the whole, we are not such a litigious society yet, but alternative dispute resolution is catching on, and I feel very strongly, I mean, we have always advocated for, you know, some kind of counselling solutions for family disputes, rather than the usual, you know, system that we have, which is adversarial. So it's a good move, and it's quite a change in the system of courts.
In the system of thinking as well.
Yes. And I think that it bodes well for families, our families. The other thing I want to bring up also at this point is the question of how successful it is. I think a lot depends on how we gather our facilities,
Absolutely.
and I think the counsellors are doing a marvelous job to try and work this one. The lawyers do try, you know, even, you know, matrimonial lawyers are a bit different from the usual commercial or other types of,
You're less
we are less. We are not. I think we are less combative, you know, to be fair, you know. We try to see, because we understand the problems. We understand the problems of a family. It's so complex.
Sure.
It's not something that's cut and dried and, you know, somebody's right and somebody's wrong. If you examine the whole thing, it's usually, you know, somebody may be a little bit more right than, you know, than the other party.
I guess that's the reason why we're having this discussion, to bring up a lot more of the grey and move away from the archetypal definition of black and white. Because the world has changed, especially because it's a lot less black and white.
Yes.
You know? So one of the key things for me, one of the key takeaways from this discussion is that the Women's Charter is double-edged. You know, on the one hand, it has certainly helped to protect women. You know, on the other hand, protect and empower women. On the other hand, in a very ironic way, it perpetuates the notion that women are the weaker sex, that women need help. Need help from men, need help from society, from the judicial system, and so on. And it's one of those things, as long as you continue with this, it becomes a crutch, and then women will continue to be the weaker sex. Right? So we need to find a way to move away from this psychologically. Right? And the answer is not always in legislation. Legislation, if you use that, if you emphasize so much in legislation and fine-tuning and sharpening it, you're going to make society and the conflicts in society a lot sharper. Nobody is going to be the better for it, especially the children are the ones who are going to suffer. Right? So I think we all need to step back and ask ourselves some very basic questions, and these questions are very likely to be inconvenient questions. What kind of a society are we evolving into? What kind of a society are we preparing for our children? How inclusive a society are we, or are we prepared to continue to pay lip service to it? We have heard the word inclusive used for years now. I remember PM Lee Hsien Loong, when he was sworn in first time as Prime Minister, he emphasized the need for being an inclusive society. But if you continue to define inclusive narrowly, you're going to create cynicism in the use of the word inclusive. So, as a society, we need to ask ourselves these questions. It cannot be about law, it cannot just be about the Women's Charter. And it has to do with shifting the way we think and shifting socio-cultural mores, if need be. And not jealously guard it just because we are Asian. If you are Asian and something Asian is wrong, we should be strong enough to say we don't want that. And it is something that we need to pay a lot more attention to. And as a final comment, I feel that the true success of something like the Women's Charter is when we don't need a Women's Charter in Singapore. We need to work towards that. Where society, where people conduct ourselves inclusively without someone telling us you should be inclusive. On that note, it leaves me to thank my panelists. Wonderful comments. I still think men are not that bad. And
we've never said that they are. Come on.
It was all in your expression.
No,
you know?
let's be fair.
And the audience, okay? You started off a bit slow, a bit scared, a bit shy, but you warmed up and you warmed up. There was no holding you back. Thank you very much. And do not let the debate end here. Log on to our website, www.inconvenientquestions.sg, and join us in the discussion. Don't forget, this is very important, to like us on Facebook, even if you don't like us very much, and watch our previous debates on our YouTube channel. Remember, you ask, they answer, we make it happen. This has been IQ Inconvenient Questions.